You're now watching the Danny Mac Podcast on the Bet Rivers Network.
Welcome back to a throwback installment of the Danny Mac Podcast here on the Bet Rivers Network. It's been almost 25 years since I've talked to my guest today, Erik Kramer, number 12. Thanks for your time and welcome to the show. How you feeling?
I feel great, and thanks for having me on. This is fun to be back. Anytime to come back and touch base with the Chicago faithful is fun.
We need to get to the emotional pains, and I recently learned that after the 95 season, when you set Bears records, you were not necessarily doing cartwheels over your performances, and I just can't help but wonder if that is symptomatic of your depression. Is it, and where does your depression come from? And please define for our listeners and viewers the difference between sadness and depression. They're not brothers.
No, they're not. They're not even in the same family. And so, my first bout of depression, what came in the 94 season. And that was my first year in Chicago. That was the first year. You mentioned junior college and or NC State and beyond. So when I came to the Bears, that was the first time since youth football that anybody said you were going to be the quarterback. Not in high school, not in junior college. I went to Pierce Junior College because it was down the street from my house. It was literally a mile away. And we ended up, for most of that season, being ranked number one in the country, whatever that means. But we were pretty good. And so when I went to NC State, there were two other junior college quarterbacks that went there also. And so, coming to the Bears was the first time anybody had ever said, we want you to be the guy. And ironically, 10 years earlier in 1984, Ron Turner was the quarterback coach at Pitt. And so they had also recruited me. And I didn't go there. So 10 years later, he's basically, he and Dave were recruiting me to come to the Bears. And so I felt when it didn't work out initially and Steve Walsh began playing and we started winning, that's when it hit me like, it doesn't really hit you. It sort of comes over you, kind of like I don't know, like your field of view kind of starts to narrow and sort of this fog comes over you. And there's really nothing to fight against. There's no way to jump out of that, whatever, malaise that you're in. There's nothing to fight against. There's nothing to push against. And it's just something that sort of, it's a perspective or a lack of that kind of envelops you. And I didn't want to get out of bed. And I didn't want to look people in the eye because that would invite them to say hi. And then I'd have to say hi back. And it didn't feel good. Like I knew how to get there. I knew how to get to the office or whatever. And I knew I had to make this right turn, but I didn't want to make it. And I remember there was like a players only meeting, and I'm not going to say who led it, but and this was, by the way, the first time I was making any real money. And so, but not playing. And so at this players only meeting, nobody got called out by name, but the general gist of it was, hey, you guys need to start stepping up and making plays. And I felt like it was directed personally at me, which was not the case. And if I act like I'm friends with the guy who said that,
Mm-hmm.
and in no way was he directing it at me. But when you're in that depressive state, it robs you of what would be your normal, real perspective.
External events then magnify it. You went through a divorce with Marshawn. You had two sons.
Right.
Griffin and Dylan. And Griffin was an outstanding high school athlete, quarterback like Daddy, who started testing the boundaries. And any of us who have had kids in the last 30 years are aware of the dangers that are on the streets for good kids, for good students, for athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Heroin is an epidemic. Opioids are an epidemic.
Right.
It's a dumb question, but it's the only one I can. What was it like to go through his progression into drug addiction and his eventual overdose that took his life?
So it started. I remember one thing that stands out is I remember this is in Griffin was in the summer of his 8th and 9th grade year. So he's going to go from middle school to high school. And Marshawn and I were seeing a family therapist
Counseling.
at the time. And the subject of Griffin kept coming up in terms of, Marshawn would be driving not far from the house, and they would be arguing in the car, and Griffin would certainly being disrespectful. And my question to her would be, okay, why didn't he walk home? And that just never occurred to her. And so eventually Griffin came in and with us and started coming, occasionally. And at that time, Chris